So now we're going to talk about portraits, photographing people, though it can also be, by the way, our pets, our horses, but mostly people. Depth of field is one of the key things when you're photographing portraits, simply because depth of field is that way of saying to the viewer, this person is in focus, their eyes in focus, and the background behind them, which is oftentimes distracting, is out of focus. So one of the primary things you'll be thinking about when you're photographing portraits is controlling your depth of field. Portraits typically fall into two categories. What I would broadly think of as controlled portraits or posed portraits, and then candid portraits, where the people are more active and they're not necessarily interacting directly with the camera. Either can be made with or without the subject's awareness and or cooperation. No matter how near or far you are from the subject, though, you always need to keep in mind the elements and the composition techniques that we've been talking about that will help your image communicate whatever it is you want to say. So just because that's your beautiful baby, or that's that wonderful dog that's been your friend for so many years, that love and that affection and that narrative that you have in your head will not necessarily come across unless you use all the tools that we've been talking about before. Rules of thirds, leading lines, controlling your focus, and just solving all the photographic challenges to make sure that your images have the kind of narrative that you want them to have, so the other person looking at that photograph of your baby or of your dog or your grandkid has the same emotional reaction to them that you had when you made the image. Here's an image on the left, for example, by Frank Siteman, again, a Digital Photo Academy instructor in Boston, using a DSLR. And he has a lot of depth of field in this case because he wants you to both see the subject, the model in the foreground, and the line of the train tracks going off into the distance. And so in this particular case, he's gone against the convention, because most of the time when I do portraits, I tend to have shallow depth of field, because most of the time I want the one person in focus and the background out. But in this case, he turned that rule on its head and actually is using a lot of depth of field to make the background the second part of the narrative after the subject in the foreground, which is the primary part of the narrative. This is my wife, made with a mirrorless camera, very close in. And you'll notice I technically cropped her chin off and I cropped a little bit of her head. But a lot of times when you're doing portraits of people, you want to think, how few elements can I get away with? And so that's why I moved in so close to just show a little bit of her ear, part of her face, but I'm not showing the rest of her body and torso, because the really important elements to me are just her eyes and her face. And so I'm distilling it down to just that. A couple of portraits, one of mine on the right, made with a mirrorless camera, one of Frank's on the left. And you'll notice that most portraits, like these two, are vertical. However, the last one I showed you, of my wife by comparison, was horizontal. So it's all about when do you use which format to tell what kind of story. The portrait on the left, Frank has very shallow depth of field, so the subject is in focus, his hair is really interesting, but the background behind him is out of focus, and so that's keeping our attention on him. My portrait on the right has similar use of depth of field, but I was also moving around a little left, a little bit right, to keep the face of the subject interesting, to make sure the background behind him, the bushes and the plants and the trees, were not distracting. Some more portraits, in this case of Frank's. This is the sort of typical portrait that we oftentimes do, where the subject matter is interacting with the camera, and it works well in this case, and it works doubly well because, again, he has shallow depth of field where the two kids are in focus, but the background is out of focus. Another one of Frank's where, well, unlike the previous one, because it was two people, it worked very well as a horizontal image. This is one person, tends to work better as a vertical image, focused on the eyes with very shallow depth of field, so the kid's in focus, the background behind is not. This is what's typically called an environmental portrait, another photograph by Frank Siteman. So you have both the woman and the bottles that she's selling, and you have a portrait of her, and you have some context of her job, her life, etc. And this is what a lot of editorial or magazine photographers like myself do, is we get paid to do editorial portraits where you put somebody in the environment so you can see both who they are, their face, possibly some of their dress and their upper torso typically, but you'll have the remainder of the scene is typically going to be some kind of space, work environment, product they're selling, business, etc. And when you're working with kids like you have in these two portraits by Frank Siteman, one of the things that's foolproof, of course, is bringing in animals, simply because the kids and the animals seem to love each other, and also the kids become much more comfortable, much less aware of the camera. And this is really the classic example of, I think, both images work well. The one on the left is a horizontal. The one on the right is a vertical. The one on the left, there's a little more depth of field so you can see the rocks to the left and the trees in the background. And then the one on the right, Frank has used a very large opening with a very shallow depth of field, so only the kid is in focus and the background behind is way, way out of focus. And to have limited depth of field like you have on the right, or more depth of field with a medium or even a small opening like you have on the left, one is not better than the other, but you'll see that in both of these images, the use of focus creates a very different experience for the viewer. With posed or controlled portraits like you just saw, there's a very clear interaction that's going on between the photographer and the subject matter, whether or not, by the way, the subject matter is looking at the camera. With candid photographs, by comparison, you can do things like catching a baby while they're sleeping, or something like that, a kid's playing, and getting in very close. And so this particular photo, I think, works particularly well as one of Frank's, because the parent has actually been cropped largely out. The parent becomes more symbolic, and the child becomes the dominant part of the narrative. Another more candid image of mine from India. This is a little girl who's actually in a block printing shop in India, and that's her father in the background working. And I was actually making photographs of him, and then as I passed by her, I started to frame up a picture of her, and then she gave me this wonderful face. In the last image, the subject was interacting with me, though it was more of a candid photo than a controlled photo. Here's a more casual photograph where the subject is not interacting with the camera. In this case, playing guitar, is sort of mentally somewhere else. And so this is one of those photos where you don't necessarily need to see the eyes. But the fact that he's got a nice portrait, he's limited depth of field, a nice background that's not distracting all your attention, all of those elements are adding to the narrative of the photograph. Another photograph of mine made with a mirrorless camera from India. This kid was actually napping in a piece of fabric, and I just poked my head in there, saw this really wonderful composition with all the leading lines, to go back to the term we've used before, drawing your attention from the orange on the perimeter to the kid in the middle of the image. Another photograph of mine made with a mirrorless camera, also in India, and the leading lines in this wooden boat, which is being built by hand, as you can see here in Western India. The leading lines of the piece of wood take it from the edges all the way into the photograph until you see the worker, who's the primary subject in the photograph. And finally, one more portrait of mine made in Western India as well. The light source, if you pay attention, is to the left outside the frame, and it's coming in from the left, creating the dramatic lighting right on the edge of the man's face as he's working, actually doing shoe repair. And so this is one of those cases where if I'd used the evaluative meter or the regular meter on my camera, the exposure probably would have been wrong. But in this particular case, I used a spot meter and read off the little anvil, which is in the lower left-hand corner of the frame. Took my reading off that one spot to get the correct exposure, and then let the rest of the image drop to that nice, dramatic, dark composition that you see here. So the key to portraits, obviously, is photographing people, but you know that. Really, the key to portraits is taking all the lessons we've been talking about before, things like leading lines, rules of thirds, and the technical tools that are part of your camera, the aperture, the shutter speed, the focus controls, all of those, and then, of course, going out and applying them, photographing people. Also could be dogs. Don't be afraid to actually practice on things like a mannequin or a statue, because that'll get you practicing on the things like the tools of focus, the tools of depth of field, and then, of course, you want to graduate from something that's inanimate to something that's animate and moving around. And then as your time goes on, you'll first do more controlled ones, and then eventually you move on to doing more candid ones where you let the subject matter move about. And along the way, you should just be practicing all the steps that we've been talking about, taking a lot of pictures. Again, there may or may not be masterpieces, but the only way you're going to get better as a photographer is to take a lot of pictures, look at them critically, figure out what worked, what did not work, and then go out and do some more using the things that you learned, and really, frankly, learning from all the mistakes that you made.
Have you had your picture taken before? You're ahead of the game. So you're going to be really easy to do. We're going to take a portrait of you and your dad on this pretty chilly day. You look a little bit cold. We're going to walk up to a shed where we can get you, hopefully, in your dad's arms, and you'll be a lot warmer. Let's go up there. We're doing a portrait today of Jake and his dad, and we're dealing with a rather poor illumination. We're dealing with very poor illumination. It's a terrible day, totally overcast sky. To make the best out of this situation, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to use a very large aperture, throw the background out of focus, and come in tight. So, Jake, you got a great look. But what I'm going to ask you to do, I'm asking you to move your face around a little bit. Can you lower your chin a little bit, stick your head out towards me like it's a head coming out of a turtle shell? That actually makes you look better. And when you do that, it creates a separation between your face and your body, which is a really good thing. Now, of course, we can also get you to, we could also get you to smile big. That was great when you did that before. Lick your lips once. It'll loosen up your whole face. Okay, great. And then chin down a little, Jake. Chin down a little more. Down a little more. Down a little more. Pretty good. I'm trying to make a portrait of a good friend, Clay, and his son, Jake. Jake's a very good-looking guy. How do you get a good portrait out of him on a day when the light is just terrible? Well, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come down sort of to Jake's level, but a little bit above him. And then I'm going to zoom in. Now, Clay, I'm going to get you to look over at me so I have your connection. And Jake, I need you to, Jake, you're almost perfect, but I need you to pull your collar down from in front of your face. That way we can see a little bit of your neck. Great. Now, by coming in really close, the background actually gets thrown further and further out of focus. And that's the post. I'm coming in right in there. Rule of thirds has Clay's eyes in the upper right-hand quadrant. Everything leads to him. This is one of these situations where there's leading lines going on as well. The boards in the background are actually creating a boundary which forces you into our subjects. And one of the other things, oh, Jake, you're looking scared, Jake. One of the things that really helps portraits is like dealing with your subjects like they're people, talking to them, having fun with them, and let them interact with you, even if it's just their eyes. Now, part of the stuff you say to people while you're photographing, it might make you sound like an idiot, but it does put them at ease. Now, Clay's looking like he's hating me right now, but I know he doesn't. And Jake got a kick out of that. And all these things generate different kinds of looks, which are all worth going after. Getting people out of their comfort zone affords you a great opportunity to make a unique portrait, a portrait of that person that may even be unique to them. Threatening sometimes works, cajoling, asking them to think about anything that's from the absurd to the common. I frequently ask people to think about where they would go when they were retired, or what they would do if they were an outlaw, what kind of an outlaw they would be. These are ridiculous questions, but people always respond with some sort of look, some sort of gesture, and pixels are cheap. And you can make a lot of different pictures, later selecting just the one. I always had a motto in advertising when we used to shoot 30, 40 rolls of film for one picture, and that was, we only need one frame. So Sophia, you're in high school now, right?
Yeah.
Okay, we did a portrait of you once before. This is gonna be totally different. Well, the interesting thing about this is, like, if I do this with a wide angle, I get all this background, which doesn't help, but if I come in tight on you, it's beautiful. Now, one of the things that would help us right now is if we had a reflector, and we do. I'm really big on, Jake, you wanna help me out here? Come on over, Jake. Come on, Jake. This is made out of aluminum foil and cardboard. Now, light on your sister's face. This is filling in the little. Hold on to it, Jake. Can you see the difference it makes, Jake? Take a look at your sister. Light on and light off. See the difference it makes? So we're going to keep it just like that, okay? Now your job, you can even rest it against her. Thank you. Now we're going to come in and we're going to find that the shadows under her eyes have been filled in with this really nice light. In order to really do a portrait of Sophia, I'm going to come in pretty tight. That's as tight probably as I want to come in, and I'm putting her in the upper third quadrant. And the real beauty of this picture is being made by Jake, who's holding the reflector. Now, if you put your hands together so their wrists on top of each other, and try not to look as cold as I know you really are. There you go. And Jake is making all the difference in the world. There you go, Jake, thank you. And chin down just a little bit. One of the things that makes this a more soulful picture is if I raise the camera up a little bit, which is changing the angle. To make a totally different picture, I could turn this vertical, use a wider angle, and come in even closer. I'm going to get Sophia to look directly into the camera lens.